All right, let's dive into kayak technique today. We've got a whole bunch of Ivan Lawler's coaching videos that you guys sent in. We're going to be looking at his method for like paddling efficiently. Think of this as like getting a personal masterclass from a world champion. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what really struck me about Ivan's approach is he's so focused on biomechanics, really building a stroke that's like minimizing wasted energy and maximizing the power you put into the boat. You'll notice this throughout all the videos.
Totally. We're going to try to distill like hours of this coaching into key takeaways, things you can actually use out on the water, right?
Mm.
So let's start with the foundation of the stroke, the feet and legs.
Yeah, he's super big on this. Everything starts with the stable, locked-in foot position, right? It's like your only fixed point in the boat, and it's where all the force is generated.
Right. I remember him saying that if your heels are like sliding around on the boat, you're basically leaking energy before you even start the stroke.
Yeah.
It's wild that he even used to modify his own footrests to get that solid connection.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, think about pushing off the floor to jump. You want that same solid base for your paddle stroke. And it's not about like frantic knee action, you know? It's using your legs to drive powerful hip rotation.
So it's not how much your knees are moving, but how well you're using your legs to rotate your hips.
Exactly, yeah. The signs of good leg drive are in the hips, not just the knees. And that kind of brings us to the pelvis.
Which he really stresses that this is where things can go wrong.
Big time. It's the link between your powerful legs and the rest of the stroke, right?
Mm.
If it's unstable, you're just losing power. Think of it like a wobbly gear in a machine. It's just not going to work efficiently.
He's got this visual demonstration where he marks his students' shirts with lines to show how the pelvis should and shouldn't move.
It's a great visual, right?
Yeah.
And it really shows the importance of strong glutes, too, for maintaining that pelvic stability.
We should talk about some of those exercises he recommends later on. But for now, let's move up to the trunk. So we've got a solid foundation, a stable pelvis. Now the trunk comes in. What's its role in this whole power generation thing?
Think of it like the transmission, sending the power from your legs up to your shoulders. And it's also resisting forces from the paddle, keeping you upright.
I love how he compares the trunk to like a rigid structure, connecting the hips and shoulders. It really shows how important core strength is.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's also where I think a lot of paddlers make some big mistakes, like bobbing and side bending.
He is super adamant about not bobbing. Says it's totally counterproductive.
It makes sense, though, because the muscles you use to bob are the same ones that you should be using for that hip movement. So you're working against yourself.
Right, totally. And side bending.
Oh, man. It's like a leaky pipe, you know? You're just losing all that power you generated.
So no slouching allowed.
Yeah.
Keep that trunk stable. Now let's talk shoulders.
Shoulders, yeah. He calls them the lid.
The lid. What does that even mean?
Think of it as like containing all that energy, right? You built it up from the ground up, and now it's keeping it directed into the boat.
So they're not just generating power through rotation. They're also resisting the force from the paddle.
Exactly. They're preventing the paddle from like flinging you around.
Yeah.
And guiding its path through the water. The top shoulder is particularly important, pushing down to maintain that connection.
Yeah, he shows how leaning away from the paddle stroke, which I know a lot of people do, it actually compromises your power and stability.
Totally. It's like trying to push a door open while leaning back from it. You lose all your leverage. Keeping those shoulders stable and engaged is key.
Okay, so we've got all that. Now let's talk arms. I think this is where a lot of people get confused.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because they think paddling is all about arm strength.
Right. But Ivan's approach is totally different.
So let's start with the top arm. What's its main job?
Resisting. It's not about pushing or punching forward. It's creating a fixed point, preventing all that power you generated from leaking out.
He says it should be fixed relative to your body, not in space.
Right. It's like a moving anchor point for your stroke. And the biggest mistake people make is pushing forward too early or letting their elbow rise above their shoulder. You want to keep that strong press-up position.
He's really big on keeping the top arm engaged but relaxed, only extending fully during the recovery phase.
Exactly. Now for the bottom arm, this one's a little more intuitive.
Yeah, it's one that feels like it's actually doing something.
Right. It's putting the paddle in the water, holding on during the power phase, and then taking it out. It expresses the movement of the chest and the rest of the body.
He says it's really important to not bend the bottom arm during the pull, because bending leads to scooping and a loss of power.
Totally. People try to muscle the paddle through the water with the bent arm, but that just messes everything up.
So the bottom arm is about maintaining that connection, letting the power flow through it, not generating power itself.
Exactly, you got it. It's working smarter, not harder.
This is starting to make so much more sense. It feels like we've covered a lot already, breaking down each part of his approach.
Yeah, we've laid a good foundation, but there's still more to explore.
Stay tuned for part 2. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Ivan Lawler's technique.
Yeah, we've covered like the foundations, the roles of each body part. But now I'm curious about like how it all comes together in the actual stroke.
One of the most important things Ivan talks about is this idea of pushing versus pulling. It's a subtle difference, but it's really crucial.
I think most paddlers, myself included, we tend to think of paddling as like primarily pulling motion.
It's natural, right? But when you focus on pulling, you instinctively lift upwards, which actually takes weight off the paddle and reduces your power.
Interesting, because it feels like you want to be pulling the paddle through the water.
Yeah, but think about it this way. If you're trying to lift something heavy, it's much harder to do it by pulling upwards than by pushing downwards.
Oh, I see. You get more leverage when you push down.
Exactly. And that's why he's so big on generating downward force with that top shoulder. You want to feel like you're pushing down through the paddle to lift yourself up out of the boat.
So instead of pulling the paddle through the water, we should be thinking about pushing it down.
Exactly. The more downward force you generate, the more weight you have on the paddle, and the more efficiently you can propel the boat forward.
It makes sense. It connects back to that whole body connection we talked about.
Right.
But with a focus on directing that force downwards into the water.
You got it. And this also ties into another really important concept, sequencing and timing.
So it's not just about moving our body parts. It's about moving them in a specific order
Yeah.
and at the right time.
Yeah, exactly. Think of it as like a chain reaction. Starts with your legs, then moves through the hips, core, shoulders, and finally the arms. If one part is out of sync, the whole system suffers.
It's like a domino effect where each piece needs to fall in sequence.
Exactly. So let's break down that sequence. Starting with the legs. You initiate the stroke with leg drive, transferring power up through the pelvis and trunk.
Then the shoulders engage,
Mm-hmm.
resisting that upward force from the legs and guiding the paddle into the water.
Right. And this is where that downward force becomes so important. You're using your shoulders to press the paddle down, almost like you're trying to push yourself up out of the boat.
And the arms, what are they doing?
The arms are the last link in the chain. They basically just express the movement of the rest of your body. The top arm resists that downward force, creating a fixed point, while the bottom arm simply holds on, letting the power flow through.
So it's not about muscling the paddle through the water with our arms.
Nope, not at all. It's about letting the power generated by your legs and core do the work, while your arms simply guide the paddle and maintain that connection.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
Yeah.
Now, what about the timing of the stroke? He talks a lot about the catch. That moment when the paddle enters the water.
The catch is crucial, because it's the moment when you transfer all that built-up energy into the water. But here's where a lot of paddlers make a mistake. They try to hit the catch, thinking they need to slam the paddle into the water with force.
Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that. It feels natural to want to attack the water with the paddle.
I know, right? But it's actually counterproductive. When you hit the water with force, you create a lot of resistance, which slows you down.
So instead of trying to force the paddle into the water, we should be aiming for a smoother entry.
Exactly. Think of it like a knife cutting through butter. You want a smooth, clean entry. That minimizes resistance. Ivan talks about placing the paddle gently but firmly into the water.
Okay, that makes sense. So once the paddle's in the water, what happens next?
Then you engage your core and legs, driving the paddle through the water, while maintaining that stable, connected position we talked about. The catch is the foundation, but it's just the beginning.
So how can we tell if we're actually doing it right? Are there any signs we should look for that indicate our technique needs work?
There are. Ivan points out a few visual cues you can use.
Okay, tell me everything.
First, pay attention to how the boat moves. If the boat dips down when you're pulling, that's a sign you're not generating enough lift.
So that means I'm probably pulling instead of pushing.
Exactly. You want the boat to lift slightly as you pull. It shows you're transferring power effectively.
So the boat's movement can tell us a lot.
It's great feedback. Another thing to watch out for is leaning. Remember how we talked about keeping the trunk stable?
Yeah, no slouching.
Right. If you find yourself leaning away from the side you're paddling on, that's a sign you're losing power and stability. You want to maintain an upright posture with your weight centered over the boat.
Got it. No leaning. What else?
Pay attention to your arms. If your top arm is collapsing, or if your bottom arm is bending too much, that's a sign you're using your arms to muscle the paddle.
Instead of letting the legs and core do the work.
Right. Remember, your arms should just be extensions of your body, not independent power generators.
So it all comes back to that connection, maintaining that strong, stable line from my feet all the way through to my fingertips.
Exactly. And finally, listen to the sound of the paddle. If you hear a lot of splashing or slapping, that means you're hitting the water too hard, creating unnecessary resistance.
So even the sound can give us clues.
Absolutely. A good catch should be quiet and smooth, with the paddle slicing into the water cleanly.
Wow, this is all so helpful. I feel like I'm already seeing my own paddling in a whole new light.
That's what's so cool about Ivan's approach. It's not just about teaching you movements, it's about giving you a deeper understanding of how it all works.
And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. We're not just learning how Ivan paddles, we're learning how to paddle better ourselves.
Exactly.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our deep dive on Ivan Lawler's kayak technique. I'm already feeling like I want to get out on the water and try out all this stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's inspiring, right? To see someone so dedicated to mastering this.
We've talked about foundations, the push versus pull idea, the importance of sequencing and timing. Now, I want to get into some of the finer details, things that could really make a difference in our technique.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that's often overlooked is the exit. That moment when your paddle leaves the water. It seems simple, but Ivan points out some really important things to consider.
He's big on taking the paddle out with the back of your hand, not the front. Why is that? It seems kind of counterintuitive.
It all goes back to minimizing energy waste, right? When you lift your elbow first to take the paddle out, you engage all these muscles in your bicep and forearm, creating tension. And it can actually pull you off balance.
So it's like starting another movement. That's working against the forward momentum you've built up.
Exactly. And remember how Ivan talks about the shoulder blades being key for connecting your arms to your body?
Yeah.
Well, when you lift your elbow first, those shoulder blades detach, and your arm is basically disconnected.
So you lose that stability and power transfer.
Right. But when you take the paddle out with the back of your hand, keeping your elbow low, you maintain that shoulder connection and use way less energy.
Makes sense. Little adjustments can make a big difference, huh?
Totally. And Ivan also highlights something else that people often overlook, the head and gaze.
He says you got to look where you're going, which seems obvious. But I know I'm guilty of looking at my paddle sometimes.
Yeah, it's easy to get focused on what your hands are doing, but your body follows your gaze. If you're looking down, you'll tend to slump forward, and that messes up your posture and power.
It's like keep your eyes on the prize.
Exactly. It's not just about motivation, though. When you look where you want to go, your muscles actually adjust to steer you in that direction.
So it's about having a clear intention and letting your body follow through.
Yeah, it's like a mind-body connection, using your gaze to direct your movement.
And that's especially important in tough conditions, like waves or a crowded start.
Oh, absolutely. Instead of focusing on the obstacles, focus on where you want to go.
Your body will figure out the rest.
Right.
That's a great visualization technique.
It really is. And the cool thing is, all these insights apply to any kind of paddling,
Yeah.
Racing, touring, just messing around on the water.
That's what I like about Ivan's approach. It's not just about teaching you movements. It's about giving you a framework for understanding the principles of paddling efficiently.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up here, what's the one thing you want listeners to remember?
I think it's this. Efficient paddling is a whole body thing. It's about understanding how each part contributes and connecting those parts to minimize waste and maximize power.
It's not about brute strength. It's about finesse and timing and awareness.
Exactly. And the journey never really ends.
Well said. It's been awesome exploring all this stuff with you, getting deep into the details of efficient paddling technique.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Hopefully everyone listening is feeling inspired to approach their paddling with more curiosity.
Yeah, and a focus on maximizing their efficiency.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Happy paddling.